there's like 1,000 different kind of like variables that's going to kill your startup. Like if you think about any other job, there's probably not 1,000 plus ways for you to die. There's maybe like 1 or 2 things that you can do very poorly and then you'll die. Most startups fail because people can't work together. Along the way, it might be a really good startup. You just can't decide on the direction of the company or what to do because there are no right answers. That kills a lot of startups. So lots of ways to die, I think, is the answer. Hey everyone, this is Brian, managing partner at Iterative. I'm a serial entrepreneur, previously founder and CEO of Divvy Homes, a $2 billion valuation company. Previous to that, did Weave, which was a Y Combinator company, and also Decide.com, which is a Series C company eventually acquired by eBay. I'm here to answer some of the most popular questions from Quora. What are the best ways to think about ideas for a startup? That's a great question. I think the best ways to think about ideas for your startup is actually not to think about ideas and instead go back to the things that you've experienced in your past life, maybe in the past year or so, that you're very, very frustrated about or very angry about. Oftentimes, I think what's interesting is founders kind of get lost while they're building companies. And so always going back to something that you've personally kind of like experienced in a very visceral way is the best way to kind of like write your startup when it's kind of like wrong. So I would say don't think about ideas because none of them are going to be any good. Think about the stuff that you hate or the stuff that makes you really angry, problems in the world that you really want to fix. You could tackle other people's problems, but it tends to be much harder because you're relying on other people to then help you kind of like navigate. If you're solving your own problems, it's a way, way easier way to build a company and a very large company because you're building it for at least a customer of one. What is the best advice for a young first-time startup CEO? I think a lot of first-time CEOs think that it's all about whatever they're good at. Usually it's like coding or product or maybe marketing or anything like that. The real answer is a lot of times the things that you need to get really right as a first-time CEO is leadership, communication, and culture. And so I think for a lot of first-time CEOs, my advice is learn those things. They end up being the most important things in building an organization. What are the best productivity hacks of startup CEOs? I think there's a lot of productivity hacks, and every single probably quarter, I'll try something new. I'll tell you guys the stuff that's working for me now. So I started using this app called Clockify, and it's just a timing app. So it literally was built for contractors with timesheets. But every time I start a task, I say what the task is, I'll go set a timer. And then for whatever reason, it keeps me focused, right? Because I can always refer back to like, this is what I'm doing, and this is the time that I'm committed to it. And so that's helped me a lot. I also can go back to all my days and be like, did I spend my time wisely on what types of things? And so it gives me the like auditability and the timing ability. So that's my latest thing. My thing from maybe like half a year ago is I consistently go to the gym. So before I didn't, and setting a time basically in the middle of my day to kind of like take a break and refresh and like restart was really good for some reason, because I think it just like split up 2 kind of like blocks of work for me. And so I could kind of like compartmentalize 2 big things that I was doing today. Have some set time where they're not doing any meetings. It's either really, really in the morning or it's really late at night. And I think, again, that just gives you time to do things that you need to do rather than kind of like people are waiting on you for. And so I think that works really well. I probably get like 300 emails a day and I'll respond to maybe like 20, 25 or so. And so one of my early tasks is like, I literally just like triage a bunch of emails and then pick out specifically the ones that I'll likely respond to. Time boxing allows you to, I think, just do focused, deep work, which I think is important for everybody. Why do so many startups fail? Maybe it's worth defining. Probably like 95% of startups fail. I would say maybe like 50% of startups will go to zero, right? Like people put in money and then all the money is lost. Another 30 to 40% will return kind of like 1x, 2x, or 3x, right? So like investors put in $1 million, they get back 2 or 3 million. In the founder's perspective, I see those as kind of like success. Actually, I see every startup as a success, but those should be successes. In a VC's point of view, they're kind of like looking for 10x, right? And so they're kind of like, oh, it's not quite successful. I think the reason why so many startups fail is because it is just really, really, really hard. So there's like 1,000 different kind of like variables that's going to kill your startup. Like if you think about any other job, right, there's probably not 1,000 plus ways for you to die. There's maybe like one or two things that you can do very poorly and then you'll die, right? And so I think that's the key reason. And one of the biggest things here is picking out the thing that's going to kill you first is also very hard, right? Like you don't know if it's, oh, my product is not any good. People on my team hate me. I don't know how to like retain any of them. Like there are so many problems that the ability to pick out the ones that you have to work on now and throw resources at it is another thing that kind of like startups fail at. Maybe kind of like the last thing here is most startups fail because people can't work together. And so a lot of times, I think a lot of people go in with great intentions of I'm going to build something, I'm going to launch it to customers and they're going to love me, right? And like we're going to sell everything. But along the way, it might be a really good startup. You just can't decide on the direction of the company or what to do because there are no right answers. And so that kills a lot of startups. So lots of ways to die, I think is the answer. 1,001 ways to die. Why do I always feel like I'm too late for all of startup trends? How can I be in the forefront of trends executing them? Okay, so you feel like you're too late to all the trends because you are. So 99% of the time, you're going to be late to something because somebody else has already done it, right? And somebody else has already tried it, et cetera, et cetera. If you look at most of the very large companies, they were also not the first in a trend. And I think maybe the right answer here is it doesn't matter if you're late to something. Like one very good example, right, is like social media. So like the number of social media companies before Facebook, I don't know, at least like 6 or 7. Right, there was like Friendster, there was Zanga, there were all these other ones that most people don't even know, and Facebook was like number 7. And they ended up doing something that was interesting, right? They realized that the playbook was going into colleges first in this kind of like really weird, fun kind of like who's hot, right, way. And then it kind of like slowly grew from there. And so you're late to startup trends because you are, but it doesn't really matter. How can I be at the front of trends? I think most of the time you can't, right? Is I think the answer. The one exception is maybe kind of like very deep tech ones, right? Where you're kind of the expert at some technology that not a lot of people have or are experts in. And so then maybe you kind of like are in kind of like a start of a new trend. The problem with this is you don't know that you're a start in a new trend, right? You're just like, I know something that other people kind of like don't spend a lot of time on. And so then you're just working on something. And so I think maybe kind of like the way to think about it is just don't care that much about whether you're late to a trend or early to a trend or what the trends are at all. Just solve a problem that you really care about. I'm going to react to some answers on Quora. Gerald on Quora basically has a 10-step, I don't know if it's a step, 10 kind of like points on why creating the future is the way to kind of like build startups, I guess. I would say I think that's true, right? As in kind of like what you tend to try to do is founders are maybe like the first or the kind of like early supporters, right? Or proponents of like some solution to a problem that other people haven't like thought about. And so in a large way, they are kind of like creating a future that kind of like nobody else sees. I think it's kind of like a weird answer because, or his answer is a weird answer because it doesn't necessarily, I think he's trying to say the same thing with trends, right? It's kind of like, no need to look at trends. You follow your own kind of like path to creating the future that you want. I mean, Matt Lerner's thing is exactly right. Oh, he even used Facebook. Facebook was late to social networking, Google late to search, Apple late to phones. So yeah, I think he's saying exactly the same thing. But at the end, he's like, what's your hurry? I think you need to be hurt. Like, you should go solve the problem. But I think he's right. Like, lots of people are late to trends and it just doesn't matter. What does it feel like to be the CEO of a startup? I think my 2-word answer is imposter syndrome. And I've thought a lot about kind of like why that's the case. And I think a lot of it is you're doing a job that you've never done before if you're kind of like first time, right? And so you're like, oh, look at all these other people who've done this job before. I'm like nobody, right, compared to them. And so imposter syndrome kind of like hits you quite hard. I think what's interesting is if you're in like a room of startup founders, everyone's feeling the same, right? So like you really can't be an imposter if everyone else is feeling the same. And I think the thing that other people don't realize is even in kind of like later stage companies, the CEOs also feel the same. Right. So like the CEOs are like, oh, I've never been a public company CEO, or everyone's kind of like different. Right. And so when the entire population of CEOs are feeling the same, you're clearly kind of like not an imposter. You're just like one of many people who have no clue what they're doing. And so that's what it feels like to be a CEO. What was the biggest mistake you made in your startup? I think I have to go back to the culture thing. And maybe to explain to people, culture ends up being really important for a company because it's the way that the company operates. And so like as you add 20 people, right, 50 people, 100 people, there are a lot of things where there are no right or wrong answers. You have to pick one. You have to like decide where the kind of like where to draw the line with kind of like gray area issues. I'll give very specific examples. Like, do you move fast and break things, right? Or do you not move fast and care about quality? And those two things are neither one of them is right, neither one of them is wrong. And you have to pick one of those or something, right, that your kind of like company believes in. What's another good one? Like, do we work 12-hour days or do we work hard, right? But like kind of whenever you want, et cetera, et cetera. Or here's a really good one. In the early days, if a project can't be finished, does everyone come in on the weekend? Or do we push it out a day? Right. And kind of like creating kind of like cultural values around all these things is important. And so I think we did a poor job in the early days of doing this, and people were confused. We didn't know what we were doing. We were yelling at each other, right, for many, many different reasons of like, move faster, don't move faster. Here's a priority. Here's not a priority. And so it was absolute chaos. I think having good cultural values early is important. I'm 28 and I'm making $450,000 a year at Google. I love my job and everything I've been told indicates that I'm on the fast track career-wise. Will it ever make sense for me to leave for a startup? Okay, you're 28 and you're making bank. I think the answer is probably not, right? Unless you really, really want to do it. And there are people who really, really want to do it because your soul is being sucked out at Google, maybe, right? And you hate all the people that you're working for. And so you hate your life. And what's more important than your life? So like you want to go to a startup because like you can't take it anymore, right? Like I could see a case for that. So if you really want the kind of like adventure, excitement, risk, and that's the thing that fulfills your life, then yeah, you should move on to do a startup. I think maybe kind of like one thing here is the average outcome of a startup, right? Especially if you join it, is not $450,000 a year. And so if you're only making like a compensation comparison, then it absolutely makes no sense. Like you should be in startups because you love it. Like that's the thing you want to do. I mean, again, like the average outcome is like not 450, but the 1% to 2% outcome is vastly bigger, right, than 450,000. And so do you want to take the like 1% to 2% chance that you might be making $4 million a year? How do I find investors for my startup? Investors for your startup usually come in two classes, like two categories, right? So there's VCs who are very easy to find because most of the time they're like semi-tech savvy, right? And they'll have at least one landing page for you to go to. So there's tons and tons of lists around VCs and how they want to kind of like see your application or startup. And so that's very easy. It maybe kind of like the thing for people to know is VCs want to give you money, right? Their entire jobs is to give money to people, including us. And so they are very discoverable and very willing to talk to people. The best way to get to VCs is if you know a founder or friend who has been funded by them or know of them, right? Like asking for it. Everything in our industry comes via warm intros. And so that's the best way to find VCs. The other class of people are friends and family. Maybe a good way is like ask your network for who has invested before instead of kind of like who is rich. And so just if you go talk to like 100 people and ask them if they know anybody that has invested before, I think that's like a good way to find angel investors. For people that don't have connections, my advice for them is find the connections. I think it's very surprising how this works. If you consistently go and talk to people and ask them like who's the richest friend you know, right? Like, or who's the most startup friend you know, then they'll introduce you to one person, and then you'll ask that next person about who their richest friend or like startup person is, right? And then probably in like 2, 3, maybe 4 hops, you'll find somebody. And so my advice to entrepreneurs is do the work, right? Of kind of like asking for these intros, and you'll find someone. I don't know if they'll give you money, but you'll certainly find people. What are the best kept secrets about startups? I think one of the best kept secrets about startups is, I don't know if this is like a good answer or not, but again, like how hard or unappealing it is, right? Because everyone from the outside is like, oh, it's going to, I don't know, go to the moon and everyone's going to love us. And like, for those people that don't know, 95% of the time, you like press the release button on your app or your website and nobody cares, right? Like you're 24 hours later, you're like, do I have one visit on the website? And maybe you do because like you sent it out to like 2 friends. And then after the like 2 visits, nobody cares for like the entire week. And this is, I think for people that don't understand how rough this is like 95% of your life as a startup. And so only 5% of the time is there kind of like something that's like remotely interesting for you to like talk about or do. And so most of the time you're just kind of like in the grind, building kind of like the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and hopefully solving a problem for people. Clarity of strategy and products is very, very underestimated. Everyone in the company should deep understanding of product. Okay. I mean, I think my reaction is that it's a decent answer, but it's not very kind of like startup specific. In every business, right? Like you want people internally to know what your company strategy, product strategy, etc. is. And so good, decent answer, but not about startups. I mean, anonymous is entirely correct. So so the people who are telling war stories about companies are a lot of times like their companies were successful, right? So they can kind of like tell the story of why it was. Maybe kind of like 2 interesting things here. The first one is like so much random stuff happens, right? Like when you're building a startup, it's hard to kind of like credit what happened. And so you're kind of like picking out certain things to kind of like tell this narrative in a quick and concise and logical way. A lot of startups, for people who haven't seen, right, look like this, right? Where you kind of like start and like you do random walks and then like maybe something happens. And that's how it kind of like a lot of stuff feels. And then I think the other thing that's interesting is if you ask a lot of, if you not even ask, if you go look at a lot of unicorn founders, the company that's today a unicorn is not their first company. It's maybe their like 3rd or 4th or 5th or 6th company. And they've been going at it for a decade or longer. And so I think certainly there's survivorship bias, but all of us can also tell you the stories of the companies that did not survive and what happened. So yeah. What startups have the best stories? What are the best stories? I'll tell you types of startups that have the best stories. So the best stories okay. The best stories actually come from startups that have raised way too much money, right? Because what ends up happening is you raise money and then you have to very quickly deploy it to grow your company, and you don't have enough time to think about what to deploy it at, right? So you're just like throwing money at random stuff throughout the life of your company. And I feel like the best startup kind of like stupid stories, right, come from people who have too much money. There's a lot of stuff, right, where like people are buying first class tickets for people, or I don't know, throwing like outrageous parties and like really stupid stuff, right, happens in the parties. And so I think that's the best stories. I think like a large part of startups are just like boring again, right? And so if you're like a regular, well-controlled startup that's growing fast, but like well-controlled, you just like don't have these these crazy stories. I think a lot of the early startup stories are fun because they're around how you got your first customers to kind of like sign up for your product. And when you try to get your first customers, you'll quickly realize that nobody cares about your product and everyone cares about like you. Right? Like, why should I trust you? Why, like who is this person who's selling me something, right? That thinks they're building a company, but really it's just like them in their like garage. And so I just remember like our early customer acquisition was, so we sell homes, right? And so a lot of this we were trying to do semi-remotely because we're a tech company and like on the phone, and we're like sending emails to people. We finally land this customer, our first customer, who I love. And I fly over and I was like, oh, this house is beautiful. And it's like, I don't know, your dream home and like all this kind of stuff. I fly over. This is one of our first homes in Seattle. And I didn't realize this, but I drove like 3 hours from the airport to this person because traffic was super bad. It was kind of like not in the middle of nowhere, but it was just kind of like out of the way. And I was like, wow, this is like really far from the city. I go to the home and I'm like, wow, this home is not as good as I thought it was. And so she was still really super happy. I ended up walking in. It was like snowing too, which was terrible because it made like traffic really bad. And I was like walking in with like the like home welcoming kind of like gift bag, and it was like all soaked. And I had actually bought a bottle of wine. The wine had like broken because I like slipped. And so it was like all the wrong things happened on my like very first customer close. But it was totally fine because like she's super happy and the house is great. And she had to like show me her backyard and tell me about stories about how her like kids will grow up and like what she's gonna change, all that kind of stuff. So it was great. But it was one of the like hardest kind of like trips out for me. I'll tell a shorter story. Okay, Divvy sells homes. So in the very early days, we were talking to a bunch of customers and we're trying to vet kind of like who's a good customer, who's not a good customer. And there are so many customers that are so shady. So there's one guy who kept on asking us, what is the largest piece of land that you guys can buy? Right? And we're like, oh, we like have never thought about that before. We like made a number and we're like, oh, maybe like 1 acre or 2 acres. And this is like during the call. And afterwards, we were like stalking him on Facebook. And we realized what he's trying to do is basically grow weed. And so I think I don't know. Obviously, we didn't buy the home, but lots of very shady characters in early startup days. All right, that's all the questions we have for today. Thanks for watching, and if you've watched this far, do subscribe to our channel. I'll see you in the next one. #HelpJune hit her OKRs.